More than a year has passed since my last video. My project is progressing and now I have all the tools that will allow me to complete the virtual reconstruction of our holiday home as it was in 2005. Last year I went out of my comfort zone, learning new tools, Blender, Substance Painter, Unreal Engine. Now my workflow is fine and I'm tackling the textures. For that, the meshes of my object must be perfect, but also the normals and their orientation. In my workflow from 3ds Max I switched to Blender to unify the object if necessary, and especially to define the false color of the IDs of each zone. Sometimes the UV map island and their shapes can be finalized at the stage before exporting to FBX in Substance Painter. Here I will choose the size of the textures 1, 2, 4K, rarely 8K. Are you still there?
Well, let's say that at the beginning there is the white sheet, the board, the screen on which you are watching this video. We define the orthonormal XY markers. You know, middle school math, the abscissa and ordinate, but here just for graphic purposes. We place the grid, because a grid is less scary than a blank page. And we can draw a little square, the pixels. You can also draw a straight line, create vector curves. That's already drawing, yes, but we're still in 2D. For volume, 3D, we need depth. That's where the Z comes in. Well, the buffer of Z. A space where vector will be able to spread out in all directions, and objects take their place.
Let's take a random object, but completely random. This teapot.
The computer only recognizes it in the form of cloud of points, the vertices, which we will connect with edges. And soon as we have triangle or rectangle, we obtain a surface. To cover this surface, we will apply a textures.
Without drowning you in technique, I will say that in terms of textures on 3D objects, there are roughly two approaches.
The first one is to deform the image that covers an object. The textures surround the object, it becomes the object. The second, more subtle, is to project the image onto the object. The deformed texture becomes coherent.
In 2022, I continued the modeling work started 8 years ago. A work that requires patience, loads of patience.
In the living room, new objects are there. The air flame oil stove, a technological marvel which consisted in burning one of the byproducts of oil, and which gave you, when you lit it, the pleasant sensation that you drain your oil car on the living room floor. In the bedroom, on the right, the large cabinet is finally finished. For the bed, I will borrow many of its elements, such as column and a beautiful work tympanum. I'm not forgetting the little details like window latch.
Speaking of window, after being locked up for so long, I felt like getting out a bit into the street.
I started to model the houses, just the front of the houses, then the building around, then the neighborhood. For the neighborhood, thanks Google, I got the model from Google Map. Very rough, but nevertheless essential to avoid making mistakes with the proportions. I replace basic shaped houses with my models, the decorum of a street, the cars.
I will come back to the cars later.
Let's just say that one of them, thanks to Google Street View, will take us to the beach, or at least we'll be able to redo the trip in VR, in a sphere.
But for now, let's go back to the house.
In the garage, I recreated from memory a small beach watering can. The modeling of my 7-year-old bike is also progressing, with a lot of pictures this time, drawing and patience. In the living room, let's move on to the sideboard and plastic chair which I presented to you last year. Here is the most accomplished object of my project, the radio CD cassette player. I will dwell on it because it's with it, as a basic of work, that I started the creation of the textures.
During the modeling, all the objects are made of plastic and receive the same uniform lighting, visually very boring in the long run. But once this stage is over,
the horizon of the final rendering finally arrives.
And from now on, I'm not going to talk about rendering anymore, because the technique is changing. After having used for a long time a term borrowed from the building sector, the rendering, today we talk about the baking. Much more appetizing, isn't it?
Because the long hours of calculation to finally have a single image belongs to the past.
Today, the graphic card calculates in real time. The wonderful world of the metaverse.
So, what is the baking? It's telling the graphic card about the nature of an object, the light that bounces off it, whether the object is rather dull or reflects lots of light, contour and shadows. Pretty cool, huh?
Once the firing is finished, we get all the information and especially the fluttering of UVW and their island.
Here are all the facets of my radio CD cassette player flattened. Here the plates of various pull and potentiometers, the loudspeaker grills, the telescopic antenna, the buttons of the cassette player, other handles, buttons and knobs.
Seeing the 3D models laid out like that, I immediately recognized the paper cutout object I used to make when I was a kid. In fact, I have spent my life reproducing my childhood experiences in a different way. I must not be the only one.
Anyway, baking takes us from the model but still uniform object to the final render with its textures and light, here in Unreal Engine, surrounded by other works in progress that I'm sure some of you will recognize. The coffee grinder, the cutlery drainer, also finalized.
3D is already a guy thing. So, modeling car, you can imagine. Let's say that when you start in 3D, cars are classic. It's the way to rediscover the joys of a childhood. I'm not going to lie, nostalgia is what 3D is too.
But for me, today, modeling about 30 vehicles, it will have been a full-fledged project. And cars have been created on computers for more than 50 years. So 3D model exists. We can see them in video games, cinema, advertising.
Even if I haven't modeled any vehicle, remeshing of the models was necessary. Remeshing?
Since I've been modeling for 30 years, my 3D has changed a lot. And the tools I use today
sometimes come up against my psychological barriers. For example, why lighten a model when Unreal Engine calculates the real-time degradation of objects?
On the screen, the further away you are from an object, the less detail you need. And the textures. It is better to have a single textures in 4K or a multitude of small textures 512 by 512 pixels.
With the real-time, I've got to admit that the value of an image is not equivalent to the hours of calculation it requires. Well, almost. So, what about remeshing?
It's recalculating the fineness of the mesh.
For the textures that will cover the models.
The UV map of the Peugeot 307 bodywork, for example, it gives this, or rather that. Because in addition of everything being flat, the trick is also to play with scales and shapes.
The 307 will be a passing car. So it's the details of the sides, like the doors, that interests me. Much less the roof, boot, bonnet, and even less the interior. So I'm getting rid of them. We will catch sight of the interior, more than we will see it in details. To remain coherent in this project, there will only be vehicle up to 2005. And in a concern of safe memory, which nevertheless logical to me, with the help of remeshing, I will create 3 categories of vehicles.
Very detailed for the street of the house, less for the vehicle passing through the avenue, and very ugly for the distant vehicles.
To conclude, I will say that in 2023, textures will occupy a large place. And if all goes well, I will finally approach what is undoubtedly the most fun aspect of this project: dirt, damage, age, scratches. Short brings imperfection in this virtual world to clean and smooth. And the final touch: trees, shrubs, hedges, even wind. And this is where my project will be very greedy in calculation. Thanks for watching.